On my first night working the graveyard shift at the Wayline Motel, I found my own name already written in the guest register, in handwriting that wasn't mine, checked into a room that, according to the floor plan taped behind the desk, didn't exist. My name is Delia Marsh, and I took that job for the same reason anyone takes a job like that, which is that nobody else wanted it, and I badly needed the money. The Wayline sits alone on a 2-lane highway 40 miles from the nearest real town, the kind of place travelers only stop at when exhaustion beats out their better judgment. And the owner, a tired, careful man named Gerald, told me during my one and only training shift that the job was simple. Check people in, hand out keys, don't bother them after midnight unless they come to the desk first. And above everything else, he said, tapping the register book with one finger like it was something that could bite, never say a guest's name out loud unless they say it to you first. Use the room number instead. Always the room number. I laughed the first time he said it. The way you laugh at a rule that sounds like small-town superstition dressed up as customer service. He didn't laugh back. He just closed the register, told me the last clerk had quit without notice 3 weeks earlier, and left before I could ask what that had to do with anything. The motel was quiet that first night, the kind of quiet that has a texture to it once you've sat inside it long enough. A low static hum from the vending machine down the breezeway, and the occasional shudder of a truck passing on the highway outside. I spent the first hour doing exactly what bored night clerks do, which is snoop through things that aren't technically mine to snoop through. And that's how I found my own name in the register, 3 pages back, in a section dated for guests who hadn't arrived yet. Delia Marsh. Room 14. The motel only has 12 rooms. I told myself it was a coincidence, a common enough name that some other Delia Marsh had passed through once, or that Gerald had made a clerical error, copying old reservations forward. I told myself several other reasonable things over the following hour, and I believed almost none of them, because underneath the entry, in the same unfamiliar handwriting, someone had written a single line that no coincidence could explain away. Told her not to look until she was ready. She wasn't ready. She looked anyway. Around 11 that night, an old sedan pulled into the lot, headlights cutting long shadows across the office window before the engine went quiet. A man came in alone, mid-50s maybe, damp from a light rain that had started without my noticing. And he asked for room in a voice that sounded like it hadn't been used in a while, cracked and careful. I gave him room 6 and slid the key across the counter. And as he turned to leave, he paused at the door and looked back at me with an expression I can only describe as pity. The specific pity you give someone who doesn't yet know something you already know. Knew, he said. It wasn't a question. First night, I told him. Then you haven't been told the second rule yet, he said. Only the first one. Gerald never tells anyone the second rule until it's already too late to matter, because he doesn't like watching people's faces when they hear it. I asked him what the second rule was, and for a moment, I thought he wasn't going to answer, that he'd simply walk out into the rain and leave me with nothing but a locked door and a bad feeling. Instead, he came back to the counter, lowered his voice like the walls themselves might be listening, and told me something that has never once left my head since. The register doesn't just record who stays here, he said. It decides who's allowed to keep existing on the other end of wherever they came from. Every name written in that book by someone other than the guests themselves is a kind of offering, a name given up by whoever's writing it, usually without even realizing what they've done. And if a clerk ever says that written name out loud to the person it belongs to, out here, after dark, the person that name actually belongs to back home simply stops. Not dies exactly. Stops. Erased backward through every memory anyone ever had of them, except the clerk who spoke the name, who remembers everything forever, alone. I told him that sounded impossible, and he agreed with me gently, the way way you agree with someone you feel sorry for rather than someone you're arguing with. Then he told me his own room number wasn't really his. He'd written it in himself that night under a different name entirely. A name I would not find written anywhere obvious. Because 30 years ago, he said, he had been the one working this same desk. And he had made a mistake he had spent every year since trying to undo. One night at a time, one guest at a time, hoping that eventually the debt would balance itself back the other way. He left before I could ask him anything else, and I watched his sedan pull back onto the highway and vanish into the dark. And I did not sleep again that night. Over the following week, I worked every graveyard shift Gerald would give me, partly because I needed the money, and partly because I could not stop thinking about room 14 and the entry with my own name in a stranger's hand. I started reading back through the register in my spare hours between check-ins, going back further and further, and the pattern I found made my hands go cold in a building that was, if anything, too warm. Every few months, scattered unevenly across years of entries, there was a guest name written in handwriting that didn't match any of the surrounding entries, always accompanied by a short note in the margin, always in that same careful, guilty hand. Told him not to open his eyes, told her the sound wasn't real, told them both to keep driving. Each note read like an apology written just after the fact, the private confession of a clerk who had said something out loud they weren't supposed to say. And each name I could later find no further trace of anywhere else in the book. No checkout, no returning visits, nothing. As though the moment their name had been spoken, they simply stopped needing a room at all. Because they had stopped needing anything. I found Gerald's own handwriting eventually, matching several of the older entries exactly. And when I finally worked up the nerve to ask him about it directly, he didn't deny it the way I expected him to. He just sat down heavily in the chair behind the desk, looking older than he had on my first night, and told me that everyone who works that register eventually writes at least one name into it without meaning to, because the register doesn't ask permission before it decides you're thinking about someone hard enough to count. You write a name on a receipt while a person's face is in your head. You scribble it on a message pad while worrying about them. You say it under your breath while filling in a reservation for someone else entirely. And if you're standing close enough to that book while you do it, it takes that as an offering, whether you intended it as one or not. So why do you still work here? I asked him, if you already know what it costs. Because someone has to be the one who never says the names back, he said. As long as somebody's willing to just hand out room numbers instead, and bite their tongue every single time a guest introduces themselves first, the debt stays quiet. It only gets dangerous when a clerk finally slips. I asked him whose name was written for room 14, and he told me he genuinely didn't know, because he hadn't written that one himself. It had simply appeared in the book one morning, 3 weeks before I was hired. The same week, the previous clerk quit without notice, and never answered another phone call from anyone who tried to reach him afterward. I went back to room 14 that night, even though the room supposedly didn't exist on any floor plan Gerald had ever shown me. And I found, at the very end of the breezeway, past where the numbered doors were supposed to stop, a 13th door with no number plate at all, unlocked, exactly the way I somehow already expected it to be. Inside was a single bed, neatly made, and on the nightstand, a spiral notebook that was clearly not part of the motel's usual supplies. I opened it and found page after page of my own handwriting, dated across weeks I hadn't lived through yet, describing this exact night in detail I hadn't experienced when I began reading, right down to the specific words I would go on to say a few minutes later, when a shape finally stepped out of the bathroom doorway behind me and said my own name aloud in a voice that sounded almost exactly like mine, testing it carefully, the way you test a key in an unfamiliar lock. I understood then, standing in a room that officially did not exist, that I had already written my own name into that register weeks before I ever picked up the pen. On some night, I hadn't lived yet, and somehow already remembered living, and that whatever had been thinking about me hard enough to offer me up wasn't a stranger at all. It was future me, some later version of myself who had eventually slipped the way every clerk eventually slips, who had said someone else's name out loud one night, and in the horror and guilt of watching them disappear, had turned around afterward and offered up her own name instead, hopping to trade her own erasure for theirs, not realizing that the register doesn't work backward, that it only ever takes forward, one debt at a time, never in reverse. I had one choice left, and it wasn't a good one. I could say nothing, let the shape in the doorway finish saying my name, and disappear the way every name in that margin eventually had, quietly, completely, remembered by no one. Or I could do what none of the notes in that spiral notebook ever described anyone trying, which was to take the pen still sitting on the nightstand, and instead of erasing my own name from the register the way Gerald had once told me was impossible, simply cross it out where it stood and write, underneath it, in my own hand, a single line claiming the entry as mine on purpose rather than by accident, refusing to let it count as something given away instead of something chosen. The shape in the doorway went still. Then it went quiet in a way that felt less like retreat and more like recalculation. The sound of something old deciding whether a new rule it had never encountered before actually applied to it or not. And after a long, unbearable minute, it stepped back into the bathroom and did not come out again. I don't fully understand what I did that night, only that I survived it, and that when I walked back into the office an hour before sunrise, Gerald looked at me the way you look at someone who has come back from somewhere you yourself never managed to return from cleanly. I still work the desk most nights. I still hand out room numbers instead of names. And I still feel the pull of that register sometimes. Late in a shift, half asleep, thinking too hard about someone I love, while my pen is resting too close to an open page. What I haven't told Gerald yet, because I'm not sure how to say it without sounding like I've finally lost whatever was left of my own good sense, is that some mornings now, when I flip forward to check the coming week's reservations, I find new pages in my own handwriting describing nights I haven't lived yet, always ending the same way, always with someone else's name half-formed on my tongue in the dark, waiting to see whether tonight will be the night I finally forget to